Good evening, friars. Welcome to this special spooky Halloween edition of Jojo Fry Rocks. Fry or die?
Cake or death? Cake, please.
In today's video, I'm going to share with you some of the spookiest, scariest, and most haunting supernatural stories from the world of rock and roll. I've scoured Google for literally 10 minutes to find 5 of the best scary stories I could find. So buckle up like Kenneth here and let's do this. Rock and roll has always had a fascination with the dark, the supernatural, and in some cases the satanic, and that has always been a theme, I think, kind of throughout the whole entire history of rock. But in some cases, this flirtation seems to have been a two-way rather than a one-way thing, and some of these dark forces seem to have flirted back on some occasions. So from staying in haunted castles and recording in cursed studios to apartments and properties that rock stars have owned that have been so tragic that they've been deemed to be cursed. These are some bone-chilling encounters that musicians swear to be true. So I'm going to be telling you the top 5 spooky stories that I could find from the world of rock and roll involving spine-chilling brushes with ghosts and otherworldly forces that have no logical explanation. From Black Sabbath to Alice Cooper, let's uncover rock and roll's most haunted legends. First, the story of Black Sabbath and the haunted castle. I don't think it's a huge surprise that the band that basically invented metal and built their sound on doomy atmospheric riffs and occult inspired lyrics attracted a fair bit of weird energy, to say the least. In 1973, they hit a writer's block while they were in LA and decided to go for a change of scene and try to get some inspiration. So they flew back to England and rented Clearwell Castle, a Gothic mansion in the Forest of Dean, thinking that this would get their creative juices flowing. So they set up their gear in the castle's dungeon, and almost straight away, strange and eerie things started happening. The castle dated back to the 18th century, and there were always rumours and legends of it being haunted, and that is partially why they chose to go and try to record there. But in his autobiography, Ozzy Osborne admits that for all their Lords of Darkness shtick, they were actually Lords of Chicken shit. And when real things started to happen, they got really freaked out and really scared. The most infamous moment happened one night when Ozzy Osborne and Tony Iommi were walking down a long corridor and saw a black cloaked figure coming towards them. Thinking it might be another band member or a crew member, they followed it, and when it ducked into a small room off the corridor, which actually was the armoury, they followed it into that room, only to find that that room was empty. There were no other exits. The figure was just gone. The castle's owners later told them that they weren't the first residents to see that cloaked figure. Apparently, it was quite a well-known ghost in the castle. That chilling encounter and the creepy vibe of the dungeon actually did help them to unblock their writer's block, and they went on to create the classic album Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, directly inspired by this. The song Black Sabbath itself was actually inspired by a supernatural scare, and I'm sure fans of Black Sabbath will already know this story very well. Geezer Butler, who was quite into the occult and collected occult books, was given a 16th century book of spells or magic by Ozzy, and he said that one night he'd put this book on the shelf by his bed, and then he'd had a terrible nightmare when he went to sleep, and he awoke to see a dark figure staring at him from the end of his bed, and he was terrified. The encounter lasted just moments, and after the presence had vanished, Geezer went to check on the book, only to find that it was gone. And that vision actually inspired the opening line of Black Sabbath. "What is this that stands before me? Figure in black which points at me." So, as far as the band were concerned, all of this occultism and darkness and songs about ghosts and spirits and evil were actually part and parcel of their real lived experiences. Next is the story of an infamous cursed flat in London, which was originally owned by the singer Harry Nilsson, and in which 2 separate tragic deaths occurred. So flat 12 at 9 Curzon Place was an apartment that Harry Nilsson would loan out to his friends and to other musicians when he wasn't staying there. So this was not an unusual thing for him to do, and in 1974 Cass Elliot from the Mamas and Papas was staying there. She was actually performing a run of sold-out solo shows in London. After her final triumphant performance, she came back to the flat and went to bed and passed away from heart failure in her sleep, aged just 32. The music world was devastated. Just 4 years later, in 1978, a similar tragedy occurred in the very same room, in the very same bed. Keith Moon, the notoriously wild drummer from The Who, had been staying at the flat at Curzon Place, and he'd come back after a night out and overdosed on his medication that he was taking to curb his alcohol cravings, and again, he was just 32 at the time. Harry Nilsson was so distraught at this that he considered the place to be cursed, and he immediately sold it to Pete Townsend. The flat's dark history having sealed its reputation as a place of profound sadness and eeriness. The next tale is a disturbing story of poltergeist activity concerning Nikki Sixx from Motley Crue. Motley Crue are a band known for excess and rebellion, and Nikki Sixx has said that he got into dark symbols and satanic imagery really just to piss people off, and I can totally believe that. But the further he leaned into that aesthetic, the further something seemed to pick up on that. At the time, Nikki Sixx was sharing a house with Lita Ford, and in that house, some very strange occurrences took place. The scariest event that happened in this house was when one night when the A&R guy from Elektra Records came round to visit Nikki. He watched in horror as a knife and fork started to levitate of its own accord from the table and then shot up into the ceiling and stuck in the plaster. He turned to Nikki and he said, "There will be no more shout with the devil if you keep shouting with the devil. You're going to get yourself killed." He was convinced that Nikki Sixx had unknowingly tapped into something evil. And at that point, Nikki decided to change the name of the album from Shout with the Devil to Shout at the Devil. A small but significant recognition that perhaps he'd been going down the wrong path. The fourth story contains something that I would advise to never ever mess with. I would personally never mess with Ouija boards. I never have, and I most certainly never will. However, the band the Mars Volta learned this the hard way when they were recording their album The Bedlam and Goliath in 2008. The trouble started when guitarist Omar Rodriguez Lopez bought a vintage Ouija-style talking board for vocalist Cedric Bixler Zavala. They thought it was a bit of fun. They gave it a nickname, they called it the Soothsayer, and it became kind of a post-show band ritual to mess around with this thing, and it gave them all kinds of bizarre stories and sort of seemed to talk to them about different things. One of these stories was about a love triangle of some kind between a man and a woman and her mother, a spirit they nicknamed Goliath. And at first it actually seemed to give them some creative spark and fed into the writing of the new album. However, they said that fairly quickly the messages that they were getting seemed to turn threatening, and then they were hit with a run of unbelievable bad luck. Their home studio flooded. Tracks would randomly disappear from recordings. Their first engineer had a nervous breakdown and quit the band and told them that they were trying to drive him insane. The vocalist got a terrible foot injury to the extent where he had to actually relearn to walk. I mean, these are not just bad vibes. These are actual physical consequences. Finally, Omar was convinced that the Soothsayer was behind all of this bad luck. So he took it, broke it in half, buried it in a secret location, telling the band never to speak of it again. The band say that they see that album, The Bedlam and Goliath, as a sonic exorcism, as an attempt to reverse the curse that they had willingly entered into. Finally, my favourite story that I found is about Alice Cooper, the godfather of shock rock, and the house from the Amityville Horror, a film that absolutely terrifies me to my very core. I've only ever seen it once, I've never been able to rewatch it, so it just lives rent-free in my head, and this is really, really chilling. So this is a guy who's built his career basically on horror stories and embodying and enacting the supernatural as performance, as a stage show. So you kind of think, well, what is going to scare him? What's going to freak him out, right? So in the early 80s, Alice Cooper was working with Aerosmith's Joe Perry on the soundtrack to a horror movie called Monster Dog. Alice Cooper's manager at the time owned a house in Copiague? I don't know how to say that. In New York, thinking that this isolated setting would be the perfect place to allow Alice Cooper and Joe Perry to get ideas and inspiration for this horror movie soundtrack. It actually worked a little bit too well. It started off in quite a subtle way, so objects would just disappear in this house. They would walk around from room to room, put something down, come back to it, and it would be gone. Now, we all do that. I do that every single day. But it wasn't just one person. So Alice Cooper said that happened to him, Joe Perry said that happened to him, and so did the crew members. So it was something that was happening on a daily basis to a number of people. It had been observed a number of times. Okay, maybe that's not so creepy, not such a big deal, but it is weird and a bit strange. But then things took a more menacing turn one night during dinner, where they heard a really loud racket coming from the basement. Like 20 people moving around furniture, like thump, 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 like really, really loud, like you couldn't ignore it. And Alice Cooper says, unlike in the movies where they go, let's go and check out what's going on in the basement, he said he turned to Joe Perry and said, where are the car keys? And they got straight out of there that night and didn't go back. When Alice Cooper asked his manager about it the next day, he just casually mentioned that, oh yeah, that's the house where they wrote the Amityville Horror. And he was kind of confused because he thought that the book had been based on hauntings in a house in Long Island. But it turns out that the author, Jay Hansen, had used this particular house as a writing retreat. He also dropped into the conversation that when his own mother had stayed at the house, during a dinner party, the table had moved an entire foot to the right whilst everyone was sitting at it. Alice Cooper said, and you were going to tell me this when? His manager replied, the house was definitely alive, but he hadn't wanted to freak him out. It was more than enough to scare the master of shock rock right out the door. The world of rock has always been full of these tall tales, but coming from the kind of musicians who have pretty much been there, done that, and seen it all, for they themselves to believe these things to be true and to have been so scared by them does maybe suggest that there is perhaps something more out there than we all know. Let me know what you think. Are these just the deranged ramblings of drug-addled rock stars? Are they just embellished for effect? Or do you believe that some of these things may have actually happened? Do you know any rock and roll, scary, spooky stories? If you do, please share them in the comments. I would love to hear them. Have a great Halloween, everybody. See you next time.